Okay.
Okay, is everybody ready? So I want to congratulate the teams, Paul Logan and Draconis Walker, for making it to Parli finals. We do have a few announcements. We are going to do a flip and then do a 2 strikes. But initially, you need to be invited into the prep room. It's not just a free-for-all. So you need to be invited. And if you're invited to help prep, you're going to meet, once we're done with all this, you're going to meet outside the door there in the foyer. And we will escort you up. Prep time will not start for them until they're in their rooms. So just make sure that you've been invited and that you're out there and you can follow us. It's a little bit of a ways to get to the preference. You do work on it. Paul Logan won the coin toss, and you're going to go with that.
What is that?
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read the resolutions. I'm going to read them both, all 3 of them twice. And then we're going to start the prep time to do a 2 strike, and Op will strike first and have a minute, and then Doug will strike second and I'll have a minute. Okay. Everybody ready?
Yeah.
Resolution number 1. Stimulating corporate profits is the ultimate fix for inequality. Stimulating corporate profits is the ultimate fix for inequality. Resolution number 2. This House believes that if I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear. This House believes that if I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear. Number 3. The use of eminent domain is unjust. The use of eminent domain is unjust. So they picked number 3, the use of eminent domain is unjust.
Well, we're paid to look at the debater, but I think people also want to see the judge first too.
Okay, again, we are going to go ahead and get started, so please find your seats. Thank you. You guys are a great audience. We're going to go ahead and introduce our judges, and then we'll go ahead and get this round started. So we have a great panel here. Our first judge is Hunter Lundy. He attended Mississippi College School of Law in Jackson, Mississippi. After graduating law school, Hunter served for almost 2 years as a law clerk to Walter L. Nixon Jr., U.S. 6th District Judge in Biloxi, Mississippi. In 1986, Hunter began the law firm currently known as Lundy, Soilo, and South. Hunter is a member of both Louisiana and Mississippi state bars. Since 2007, he has been selected by his peers to be listed in the best lawyers of America in the field of personal injury litigation. Hunter has been nominated to the top 100 national trial lawyers since 2011, and super lawyers since 2010. He and his wife, Julie, have 6 children and 3 grandchildren. We also have here Representative Sonia Anderson, Republican. She represents part of Greene County, which includes part of Springfield, in the Missouri House of Representatives. In addition to her legislative service, Representative Anderson has over 20 years of experience in small business and management. She currently co-owns and operates Show Me Horses and Farrier Service. Representative Anderson is also on the executive board of directors for the 7th District Missouri Republican Assembly and is the founding member of the Multi-State Stock Horse Invitational Champion Show. This is what cold reading looks like, by the way, students. We also have Neil Evans. He has been married for 27 years and has 2 children, Will and Olivia. He is the chief engineer for KSPR-TV here in Springfield, Missouri. He's been homeschooling their children since they moved here in 2001. He plays on the worship team of his church and is in a local cover band. He enjoys talking about philosophy, theology, fast cars, and bad sci-fi movies. Colleen Enos is another one of our esteemed judges. She has a Bachelor of Science in Business from Colorado State University. She represented Right to Life Wyoming in televised and academic debates. She's a lobbyist for Right to Life Wyoming and is a certified paralegal. She's a co-founder and coach of Resolve Speech and Debate Colorado. She hearts Parli debate for its real-world application. Kimberly Millhouse is our next judge. She's from Virginia. She's a homeschool mom of 17 years. Graduated 2 sons who competed in speech and debate and are now collegiate debaters, and holds a Bachelor of Arts in Speech Communications. She is 3 years the director of Vector Speech and Debate Club in Virginia and has been coaching speech for 8 years. We also have Randy Dunleavy. He's a parent, judge, and sponsor of Apollo Speech and Debate Club. He has had both kids in this league spanning 10 years and has been judging that entire time. Jake Buxton is our next judge. He has an extensive background in STOA speech and debate, especially Lincoln Douglas and Parli. He was 2-time state champion for Missouri in Lincoln Douglas debate in 2012 and 2013. He also placed 16th in the nation in Parli debate during the 2013 NITOC. And after graduating, Jake went on to debate for Truman State University, where he is currently a senior studying political science. He's involved heavily in Missouri politics and is currently serving as the state chairman of the Missouri Federation of College Republicans. Alex Dinsmore is our next judge. She's originally from California, but is currently living in New York City. She also competed in homeschool speech and debate for 6 years and was nationally ranked in both STOA and NCSCA. For the past 6 years, Alex has enjoyed returning to NITOC as an alumni judge and representative of the King's College, where she currently works as full-time staff. I will be your final judge. I competed in NCSCA for 3 years, was 2nd place at the 2007 Nationals in Team Policy Debate. I did 2 years in college Parli after that. I'm on the STOA Debate Committee. I coach Response in Northern California. And I married one of my high school speech and debate rivals. teams here who made it to the final round. On the government side, our Prime Minister is John Hall. And our member of government is J.D. Logan. Debating for the opposition, our leader of opposition is Caleb Draconis. And the member of opposition, Wyatt Walker. And they will be debating the resolution for us today. The use of eminent domain is unjust. Let's give them a hand.
Did we come down there and introduce ourselves?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. All right.
That's just an announcement. John Hall is Prime Minister.
John name is Logan. John name is Logan.
All right, now I'm sure for the interest of both teams, we're all wondering if any of you have a particular judgment philosophy or something that you as an individual would like us to do to help tailor the round more towards you. Perhaps we could start on my right.
I'd just like to hear a good, vigorous debate on ideas, topics. That's my philosophy.
I just want to see a really good debate round, lots of good flash.
Keep you on the flow. Normally a TP judge, and so evidence is usually big in my mind, and I know it isn't always so deep in me. So give me weighing mechanisms for why I should vote one way or the other.
I understand debate semantics. I prefer clear communication and thorough communication. So I'd rather have the whole room understand what you're talking about than just giving one.
I'm interested in eye contact and controlling the argument and articulation and commanding presence in the room.
My philosophy is what you tell it should be. I would be flowing arguments and sort of make sure you're communicating.
I would follow what something follows, which is let's drag arguments across.
Be confident.
And with that, if all the judges are ready, in the opposition, go ahead and get started. It was Ronald Reagan who once stated that there are only two things in life that are certain. Those two things are death and taxes. And what's important about this in particular is that we're going to be illustrating that while taxes are certainly necessary, they're absolutely unjust. And that's going to be one of the key distinctions that we make when looking at this resolution, that the use of eminent domain is unjust. So obviously, let's start with a little bit of a resolutional analysis, providing a framework for exactly how we're going to be debating this resolution. Let's start off with the definitions. The definition of eminent domain is the right of a government or its agents to expropriate private property for public purposes with payment of compensation. With that out of the way, let's move to the second definition, that is of unjust. The second definition of unjust comes from Merriam-Webster, which is defined as not fair or deserved, i.e. not just. With that, let's move to the second part under the framework of resolutional analysis, and that is the fact resolution. Again, fact resolution. Basically what this means is that the resolution gives us a pretty emphatic statement, and that is that the use of eminent domain is unjust. We as the government team will be proving this statement true, and the opposition team has the burden to prove false. With that, let's move to the third and final point of resolutional analysis, and this is unjust. Again, unjust. This is just a little bit more clarification for what exactly this means. And there are two subpoints under this. Subpoint A is regardless of necessity. Again, regardless of necessity. As I mentioned in my opener, taxes are in some cases for the government necessary in order to create money, but they are unjust because they violate our rights and the government is taking stuff from us. Subpoint B under this is regardless of legality. Again, regardless of legality. Again, we're talking about whether or not eminent domain is just or unjust, not whether it's legal or not. So with the resolutional analysis out of the way, I'd like to present a value. And that value is of individual rights. Again, individual rights. The definition of this is that of life, liberty, and property, the things that we all have the right to. The reason to prefer this is because it's the purpose of the United States government. Created in order to give us our rights and guarantee us our rights, not to take the rights from us. Guess we'll take your first question.
Would it be your contention that jobs help you to pursue individual rights of liberty, life, and pursuit happiness?
Yes, jobs give you money and they do help you pursue happiness. I'm not entirely sure what impact that had, but I agree. With that, let's move on to the contentions. Contention number one, you can tag as fundamentally unjust. Again, fundamentally unjust. And this is where we examine this concept of eminent domain and whether or not it's just or unjust. Subpoint A is unjust but necessary. Again, unjust but necessary. The point of eminent domain is, as we mentioned in the definition, is that the government comes in and takes your property but promises compensation. And what's important about that is the government taking your property, i.e. taking your individual rights to property. What's important about this is exactly the same thing as taxation. We're not talking about whether or not it's necessary, rather, we're talking about whether or not it is just. And unfortunately, it is never just for the government to come in and take your rights, take your property, or take your property. Subpoint B under this is eminent domain is without consent. Again, eminent domain is without consent. The whole point of eminent domain is that the government has the ability to take your property whether you agree to it or not. And the point of this is taking your private property if you do not want the government to is a rights violation. Therefore, violating the criteria or value of individual rights, meaning it is unjust for the government to do so. The final subpoint under this is subpoint C, is compensation still unjust. Again, compensation still unjust. Now they're probably going to get up and respond to this and say, well, the government is providing compensation for this property, so it's all A-okay. Well, the point under this is it's impossible to determine. Again, the point under this point specifically is that it's impossible to determine. There are many examples of this. In fact, Donald Trump went to Florida and smashed an old lady's home. The reason he did this was because he wanted to build a new facility there for some sort of product he was creating in one of his many companies. And what was important about that specifically is that home had significant sentimental value to that old lady. But unfortunately, Donald Trump didn't recognize this, and in the exact same way, it's impossible to determine the worth of a home or property afterward. Why does that matter? It's because compensation is still unjust, because the government cannot accurately determine the monetary value of a certain property. To give you an example of this, let's say a robber confiscates your watch, but throws you a phone instead. Does that make the taking of the watch any less unjust? Absolutely not. It just means that they're giving you something else instead. With that, let's move to the second and final contention, which is abuse increases unjust. Again, abuse increases the injustice. Now, subpoint A under this is a court case, and this is tagged as Kylo versus City of New London. Again, Kylo versus City of New London. And this was a Supreme Court case where something very significant was determined. And what that basically was is that the United States government, under eminent domain, not only has the right to seize your private property for public uses, it also has the right to seize your private property for other private uses. Meaning that at the end of the day, the government has the ultimate authority on what your rights exactly are. And it's our contention as the government team that the government was created to protect your rights, not to take those rights away from you. Subpoint B into this is perpetuates reverse robbery. Again, perpetuates reverse Robin Hood. And basically what this analogy is Robin Hood was the individual who stole from the rich to give to the poor, but the government is the one who steals from the poor to give to the rich. The idea is that the government does not have the right to take your personal property, to take your individual rights, regardless of what their use is going to be for, regardless of whether it's necessary, and regardless of whether it's legal. It is absolutely unjust to do so. The final subpoint under this, subpoint C, is out of China. Again, China. Just to give you a real-world example of where this is actually happening. In China, they've actually displaced over 40 million individuals, specifically because of this concept of eminent domain. They have taken their rights to property, and that actually has a trickle-down effect, essentially, to their other rights. Because if they don't have a home, how are they supposed to have a quality of life if they no longer have a place to live? Just to give you another more specific example of this, 1 million of those individuals were actually displaced specifically because of the Beijing Olympics. So when we take a step back and look at the resolution we've been given, is the use of eminent domain just? Absolutely not, because it violates your rights. Thank you very much.
It's so cool. There you go. All right, so, are you guys ready? And all the judges? Perfect. Have you ever been to the DMV? I know, it's kind of, well, frankly, kind of sucky. I went there for my first time after I was 15 to get my learner's permit. And let me tell you, I waited 5 hours to get the learner's permit. Now, even though it was a very painful process, and even though for the majority of the time I was not enjoying it, it was absolutely necessary for me to reap the benefits that a driver's permit and a driver's license inevitably let me have, so that way I could get from point A to point B, so that way ultimately I could receive more benefits than just having to wait for 5 hours for a short period of time. What we see here is that although some things might not be beneficial for the short term, they pay off in the long term with more benefits on top of that. And that's exactly what we see with eminent domain, and that's exactly what we're going to show you as the opposition team in today's debate round. So first off, we're going to go ahead and cover some of the points that they made in the previous speech. But before we do that, we're going to go ahead and lay out some of our own resolutional analysis and our contentions, showing exactly why eminent domain is not fundamentally unjust like they said. Let's go ahead and look at resolutional analysis 1 of the opposition, which you can tag as the burdens. Now, the government team does have 2 specific ideas that they have to uphold in order for them to win your ballot in today's debate round. The first, you can tag as both kinds. That's both kinds. There are 2 different kinds of eminent domain. The first is when the government takes your property so they can take it for public government use. We see this in the idea of post office, for roads, for hospitals. We see this in a lot of different instances. This is called public eminent domain. But the second instance is private eminent domain. Like what they said in the example of Kylo versus New London, this was private eminent domain where they took property for private companies to use in order for them to do their company stuff. What we see here is that the government has to prove that both kinds of eminent domain are bad in today's debate round. The second burden we can tag as use, not misuse. That's use, not misuse. They have to show to you that the actual act of eminent domain, the action itself, is unjust. Not the way that governments use it, but the action in and of itself. There are a lot of things that are totally fine, like a spoon is perfectly fine. You might get with it most of the time. But obviously there's probably some way that you can kill someone with a spoon, but that doesn't make a spoon inherently immoral. And that doesn't, in the same way, eminent domain has to be proven that it is inherently unjust, not just the way the governments use it. But now let's go ahead and look over some of the opposition contentions. We have one main one with a few subpoints. Contention 1, eminent domain is absolutely necessary. Now the first subpoint you can tag as historics. Now eminent domain has been used to basically build our nation from the ground up. Let me remind you that our nation would not be here if it weren't for the railroads, the transcontinental railroad that ultimately led trade from coast to coast. That was all built through eminent domain. And our nation and our economy would not have grown like it did if it was without it. Yes.
You would agree that in order to accomplish this task, the
Yes, they did. That's what eminent domain is. All right, now let's go ahead and look at the second subpoint, which you can tag as the origin. Now, this was the first instance, or one of the first at least, of eminent domain. It was Cole versus the United States in 1876, where it was a private company, it was taking private property in order for the government to build a post office. Very simple, but very necessary. In order for people to get their mail around the area, the government had to build a post office, and they took private property in order to do it. It was a necessary thing that was done, and the people received compensation for it. Now let's go ahead and look at the third subpoint, which you can tag as specific examples. And there's actually 3 subpoints underneath this. The first is that of roads. Every interstate you drive on, in fact, the ones that most of you probably drove here today on, was built with eminent domain. Every interstate in this nation is built with eminent domain. You can tag the impact as interstate commerce. Everywhere you go, you see 18-wheelers carrying a lot of cargo on the interstates. Those are going places that is interstate commerce that you get with the interstates of public domain. Now, the second you can tag as military bases. Now, this is from justice.gov. And after World War II, 20 million acres in order to build naval and air force bases to protect national security. Eminent domain was used to build all of the air force and naval bases in our country so that way national security would be better upheld. If the government team wants to argue that national security is a bad thing, then by all means go ahead, but I don't think so.
Yes. You'd agree in order to build these air bases and naval bases, we had to take property from individuals, right?
Yeah, that's what eminent domain is. Now, with that in mind, let's go ahead and look at the impact of law, which goes back to their value of individual rights. Now, we do agree with this value of individual rights, and we do believe that it is very, something that we should definitely uphold. But we're going to provide the criterion of deontology. Yes, I didn't know this word until a couple days ago. Now I'm going to teach it to you too. Deontology is basically doing the thing that is best for the most amount of people when you know the outcomes of the majority and minority. That's essentially what this is. What we see is that when we know the outcomes of valuing the majority and minority, in order to achieve deontology and in order to uphold individual rights on the largest scale, we have to go through this criterion and do what is best for the most amount of people. Justice is something that has to be upheld. But you know what also is unjust? Not having national security, not having hospitals to treat people. All of this stuff is built through eminent domain, and it is unjust for the people who are sick. It is unjust for the people who get armed in terrorist attacks. All this stuff would be happening if we didn't have these instances that were caused by eminent domain. Now let's go ahead and look at the points that they brought up. Contention number 1, they said, was fundamentally unjust. I have one main response, which you can tag as the majority is just. The majority is just. If they want to argue that taking individual property rights for a short amount of time and kind of upsetting someone in the short term is going to be a bad thing, then by all means go ahead. However, I believe that national security and people's health should be the ultimate concern in our nation, and eminent domain definitely achieves that on a more massive scale than simply what the side effects of eminent domain are. But now, to their second contention, which was that of abuse, their application of Parli versus New London, you can tag my response as improved the local economy. Now, they said that this was a bad thing, taking from the poor and giving to the rich, but let me remind you that this actually improved the companies that moved into that area and boosted the local economy of Cairo and New London. What we see here is that it actually improved the local economy, created more jobs, and ultimately people were able to live better lives. What we see here is that eminent domain is absolutely necessary in our country, not only because it's how we built our foundation, but because in today's modern age, it's absolutely necessary for us to not be a third world country.
Oh, my judges are ready? Okay, get started. It was my favorite DC superhero, Batman, who once said, and just like this, it's not what's inside you.
Regardless of your
eminent domain, regardless of what it's supposed to do. What really matters is what it does. And what it does at the end of the day, no matter what you look at it, how you look at it, whether you look at it through the economic side or the public good side or the utilitarian side or the deontological side, the fact of the matter is that at its core, it violates individual rights. And it is that reason that we affirm the resolution that the use of eminent domain is unjust. So with that, I'd like to respond to the last speech and just basically bring up points of my own talking about how the resolution is actually true. So first of all, they talk about how we need to prove, or they talk about how the effects of this aren't actually seen, that the benefits are really long-term, so we're not going to be able to see them obviously just yet, right? Well, you can tag our response as no investment. No investment. Now, the entire point of this is that these companies, that when we're specifically talking about private companies and private eminent domain as they make the distinction, when we're talking about that, they're not actually making investments into this property. What they're doing is basically taking a free lunch from the government, which you know what that means. So what they're basically doing is taking a free lunch from the government and not making any investment. So when things are going bad, they have no reason to stay there, no reason to take it in for the long haul, and then they just move. So what we have are families kicked out of their homes, kicked out of their jobs, kicked out of their places, all for the sake of some company that's only going to be there for a few years. There's no long-term benefits to this because there are no investment, there are no vested interests that these companies have in this particular property. Now they brought up basically two burdens. The first one was proving both times, both public and private. You can tag my response as unjust. Unjust. Now this is going to be something that is going to be very repetitive in my speech, regardless of necessity. Of this, whether or not it is necessary, is not the point of this debate. Whether or not it is necessary just doesn't actually matter. What we're talking about is whether or not it is actually just. And we will be further proving that it is actually unjust at its core because it does violate our value, even through their criteria. But I'll get onto that a little bit later. So just to bring up an example of how they didn't actually have any investments in these places. Take, for example, Pfizer Pharmaceutical. This is according to actually a legal dictionary. Pfizer Pharmaceutical, actually after using the eminent domain, because things got tough for them, they cost over 1,000 jobs after basically kicking people out of their homes. So this isn't just something that we're afraid is going to happen. It's something that's happening right now. And because it's happening right now, because the government is giving them a free lunch without them having any vested interest in it, and it's hurting everybody, that it's not helping the public good, that it's just not just. Now, they talked about under their second burden, how they have to prove use and not misuse. My response to this as violates individual rights. Violates individual rights. What you are essentially doing is you are taking these people's right to property essentially, and the right to happiness as well, because of all the sentimental value that we saw, even in Kilo v. New London, how this, I believe it was the lady who was involved in this, that's actually very sentimentally attached to this home. You can't compensate for that. It just doesn't work. Now they talked about how under their first contention of necessity. They brought up a bunch of different examples under this. For example, roads, they talk about interstate commerce, etc. You can tag my first of three responses as didn't respond. Didn't respond. According to my flow, actually, they didn't actually respond, or maybe they did a little bit later on. So I'll actually get to the second contention, but basically the point under here is that we're looking at this regardless of necessity, regardless of whether or not we think this is best for the public good, whether or not it is just or unjust is the point of this debate. So really my first response to this is action itself. Action itself. As they themselves talked about in the last week, we are looking at whether or not the action itself is just or unjust. And the action, we would argue, is unjust because it violates your right to individual property. These people don't have this choice. They're just basically given a phone for this really nice watch that their dad gave them for Christmas, 30, 40 years ago, to harp on my partner's analogy in the last speech. The second response to this is reverse Robin Hood. Reverse Robin Hood. This is something my partner talked about that I believe, according to my flow, is also unaddressed, but maybe we'll see that the next week. We can help. But basically, what the point was talking about is that this is really government favoritism, how we're actually taking from the poor to give to the rich. Now, they talked about how they agree to our value, which is great. I'm glad we can agree to individual rights, because I think at the end of the day, it does support our case, well, I know. But they talked about how they would put a criterion in deontology. Now, I may be mistaken, but I actually just took a philosophy class, and I loved it. But they, unfortunately, I don't think that's what deontology means, according to what I know. So that's all I'm saying. So my first response is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism. Now, I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's actually utilitarianism that talks about whether or not you're doing something for the public good. Deontology, the very premise of deontology is the end doesn't justify the means. The means by which to do this is to take the property from these people without their consent. The end may be great in and of itself that we're trying to help the economy, but the end doesn't justify the means. That's the most fundamental principle of data ontology, that the end does not justify the means. The second end, the response to this is again going back, because we're talking about whether or not it's just or unjust, not necessarily whether or not it's necessary. Then they talk about how the majority is just essentially. You can tag my response as individual rights fundamental. Individual rights fundamental. If we are going to respect the rights of the entire community, of our entire nation, we need to start at the individual level. This isn't a top down, it's a bottom up. That's the only way to do this. You have to start at the foundation. The foundation says that individuals have a right to property and happiness and also life, so we don't want that to go away either. And the second, that was my first response. My second response is again, end doesn't justify the means. End doesn't justify the means. Again, the end of helping our economy in some way, the end of giving this free property to these people doesn't actually justify the means by which they go about, or doesn't justify the end by which they go about this. How this improved companies essentially, or improve the economy. We tag our response as expense of what? Expense of what? It improved these companies, this economy here at the expense of what? At the expense of individual rights. One of the most fundamental, and the most fundamental rights that we have here in the United States is the right to life, liberty, and happiness, and security, and all these other good things that we hold dear here in the United States. But the internet domain undermines the very foundation of this because it does not uphold the value or even the criteria presented by the opposition team that I would argue that could affirm the resolution that internet domain is in fact unjust. Thank you.
All the judges are ready? My opponents? All right, I'll go ahead and begin after I set my timer. To simply exist in a society, we have to agree to certain standards and certain conditions to even exist within that society and live as a whole. This ideal was founded by the great philosopher John Locke, and as my opponent stated, we like philosophers. But the simple fact remains that we have these social contracts and a social duty to uphold the best for the most. And this is the simple idea of the government party, the opposition team, and this is what we're going to be upholding throughout the rest of the round today. And I'll show you how in my speech, and of course, throughout the responses that I want to brought up. So first off, you can tag my first response to their entire case as for the community. Again, for the community. My first subpoint under this is corporate flight. Now, I'm going to have sub-subpoints under this, talking about what exactly we lose when we lose corporations and communities. Job loss, we have job loss. When we lose corporations from our communities, we actually have job loss. Now, just a few months ago, in North Carolina, there was a big controversy over House Bill 2, and we lost one of the biggest companies in the nation coming and building a plant so they could actually conduct their business there. And it was called PayPal. Now, we lost nearly $30 billion in the state of North Carolina because they moved away. The same goes for companies that cannot build their business because they cannot acquire properties. If we do not allow businesses to come and take root in our states and in our nations and in our counties, we will not be able to continue job growth. So again, we lose jobs when we deny eminent domain. The second thing I want to look at is poverty facilitation. If we lose jobs in these poor communities, and for specifically looking at the example of Kilo versus New London, this was a particularly impoverished community with 70% living below the poverty line. Now, New London was actually looking for someone to come in and visit a factory that would actually produce jobs. And this would allow for people to stop poverty in their area. So if we do not allow that eminent domain, and we stop this from taking place, we will actually have poverty being facilitated. Now, the impact of all of this is recidivism rates. Again, recidivism rates. When you allow poverty to take root, and we allow poverty to actually be predominant in an area like it was in Kilo and in London, you actually have a 30% higher chance of being recidivized in a lower county. Because of this, more people are committing crime, more people are being rearrested, thereby destroying the hope that young people have when they're trying to move forward out of a poor community. The next thing I want to look at is public goods denied. Again, public goods denied. Now, I want to look at the idea of deontology before I go into this idea. When we're looking at what deontology is, the simple principle states that when you can do the best for the most, you will actually be doing something that is just. So again, the idea here is if you will justly compensate one person for their property, but then build a hospital so you can cure sick people and provide jobs for the local community, then you absolutely should, yes.
What is utilitarianism?
Utilitarianism is the idea that we should do, again, the best for the most, especially in the idea of the resolution. This is just. Deontology dictates this idea. Yes?
Did you respond to my partner's analysis of what deontology actually is?
I'm actually going to go ahead and talk about that later on, but for now, let's recognize that public goods will be denied when we do not allow for public domain. The second thing is roads. Third thing, libraries, power process stations. If we do not allow eminent domain, certain communities in our nation would literally have no way to process the energy that goes to their community, because eminent domain is one of the main ways that power companies in these local areas are actually able to build their power process stations. The next thing I want to look at is military bases. Now, not when we like our military. Alright, we like our military, and we know that we need military bases. We know that we need air bases. We know that we need places where we can actually train our people, we can build our equipment, and actually ship people out to go fight for our nation and protect our rights at the very basis of where they'll be taken away. Again, the entire reason we build military bases is so we can protect individual rights within our nation. So if anything, the value of individual rights is upheld best by the opposition team, because without the opposition stand, we would not be able to build military bases. The next thing I want to look at is net benefits. And this is, again, an overall ideology that I want to go against the idea. So again, this is along with the idea of deontology and utilitarianism. All these phrases are all interchangeable. The idea of justice simply states that we should do the best for the most people. And this is exactly what we're going to be doing in the round today if you allow eminent domain to continue as a just idea. It's necessary, it's just, and it's right. But I want to go ahead and talk about the responses specifically to my opponent's case and my partner's case in the last round. So basically, my opponent started off his speech in the last round with a response talking about how we know best now, and there's no reason for companies to stay in the area where they take root through eminent domain. My response is hiring continues. Again, hiring continues. Everywhere that a business takes root, where that has an eminent domain take place, they take root and they build jobs for people. If this is not good for the people, then I don't know what is, because jobs destroy poverty. They don't facilitate recidivism like the Office of Department of Government team does. The next thing I want to look at is public, basically talking about how public and private are both unjust ideas. Now, we can basically go along with the idea of deontology here. My basic response is deontology justifies. But we already know why that's the case. So I'm going to go ahead and move down to response number 3. They talked about how a pharmacy business is one of the counties where eminent domain took place, was actually basically they let that and so on. They let something fall into a place, and I just want to go ahead and respond to this by taking most of the time. Again, most of the time, you can have that response to their pharmacy application, as most of the time, eminent domain is actually going to be a net benefit to the community. In fact, almost 90% of the time, it does lead to more jobs. This is the last one.
All right. Did you present any evidence or statistics showing how most of the time it does make a good money?
I did not, but now I did. So the same idea applies here. We know that eminent domain will benefit people on the basis of corporate flight. We'll stop corporate flight, and of course, we will no longer deny public goods if we allow it. Of course, we say eminent domain. So I want to go ahead and move down to the next idea that we're looking at. They basically said, regardless of necessity, it's still unjust. That was their main idea here, and that's the main point of the government team the entire round today. And I believe that is flawed, because if it is necessary to provide people with good things, to provide people with public goods, to provide people with jobs to protect their own individual rights, then we know what justice is. Again, the idea that my opponent brought in the last speech, or the very first speech, was the idea of individual rights. So the round comes down to individual rights proving justice. You're able to better improve your individual rights if you have a job. You can pursue happiness. You will be arrested less. And of course, liberty is one of the things that individual rights actually allows for. So again, the main idea that the opposition team wants to go away with in this round today is that eminent domain facilitates your use of individual rights in many different ways. Because we know that public goods empower you to travel. It allows you to communicate. It allows you to read because you have libraries. In fact, it allows you to have power stations so you have electricity so you can use the bathroom and take a shower every single night. But the fact still remains. Deontology dictates what is just in this round today. Thank you.
All right, John, JD, you guys ready? Sure. Perfect. All the judges? All right. let's go ahead and get started. Now, the fact still remains, I still didn't enjoy my trip to the DMV. And unfortunately, everyone who had to go through the side effects of eminent domain by the government's hands probably still didn't enjoy it either. But also, the fact still remains that we had to do it to benefit the majority. And to reject what was good for the majority and what was absolutely necessary for the majority would be more unjust, that we still advocate against the resolution and hope that you would too. Let's go ahead and look at the three main voting issues, or the biggest arguments in today's debate on that we hope you would side with the opposition on at the end of the round and feel comfortable doing so. Let's go and look at the first voting issue, which you can tag as net benefits. Now, both of the teams in today's debate are advocating for individual rights. However, we have to determine who achieves that value better. Now, let's go ahead and look at exactly why the opposition team achieved individual rights on a much larger scale. Subpoint A, you can tag as property rights. Property rights. This is exactly what the government team offers you in the thesis of their case. They say that eminent domain is inherently bad and inherently unjust simply because it takes away individuals' property rights. However, let's look at the alternative in subpoint B, which you can tag as the right to life. It's the right to life. By not having eminent domain, you lose everything that we get that is absolutely necessary for us to have. For instance, the idea of hospitals. I'm pretty sure if someone is sick and absolutely needs treatment, then they would definitely need to have eminent domain in order to build a hospital in order to get treated. Without hospitals, people would not survive nearly as much. Secondly, that of national security. Again, there are very big things that eminent domain gives us that are fundamentally necessary for our country to survive. Not only survive, but thrive as well. When you look at the idea of net benefits, you look at exactly what is going to become the most beneficial to our nation, ultimately, still having eminent domain in today's debate round is definitely going to be the best option. But now, let's go ahead and look at the second voting issue, which you can tag as necessity proves justice. That's necessity proves justice. Now, if something is needed to survive, just like the government team advocates for, I want to remind you, they say necessity is still unjust. However, that's not the case that we're advocating for as the opposition team. If you need something in order to survive, and then we deny that to you, that's unjust. That's inherently unjust. Eminent domain gives people the things that they need to survive, and to deny them is unjust. Let's go and look at 4 examples of the things that the government team wants to get rid of. Number 1, national security. Every military base in our nation was built using eminent domain. Every single one. Every single one is absolutely necessary to national security, and they were all built with eminent domain. If they want to argue property rights, then by all means go ahead. However, I believe that the right to life is inherently more important. Second is interstate commerce. Again, there's a lot of trade that goes on between state to state, country to country through our interstates. Again, this is definitely important in regards to what exactly eminent domain gives us, because it allows for our states to trade with each other, not only states, but our companies as well. This improves the economy, and this inherently improves people's lives as well. The third point we tag as hospitals. Public hospitals are built using eminent domain. Again, if someone needs to be treated because they're sick, if they have a life-threatening disease, then the government wants to get rid of these hospitals simply because it ignores people's property rights. Again, I believe the right to life is inherently more valuable, but that's just my opinion. The fourth, we can tag as the economy. This goes back to the application that they give you, which is that of Parli versus New London. However, what we said to you is that this actually improved the local economy. Again, this actually benefited the people's lives around them, and it did push away some of the property rights of people that they removed, but essentially what we see here is that it created a net gain in profitability because people were able to get jobs because of the new factories that were able to produce them. Which you can tag as the two worlds analysis. The two worlds analysis. In today's debate on whichever side you side with, government or opposition, you ultimately try to affirm a new world. You can either vote for the government and say that what we have in the current system is unjust, we got to change it, or you can stick to the status quo and ultimately uphold what has gotten us to be the #1 nation in this world. Let me remind you, our nation was founded by using the process of eminent domain. The government team has not addressed this argument. Again, everything that we used in order to get to where we are was made using eminent domain. And again, the ideas of national security, interstate commerce, the economy, and hospitals are all necessary for this. Now, the next speech is probably going to get up and tell you that individual rights is inherently important. But let me remind you, the right to life is inherently more important than that.
The judges are ready? Opposition team? All right, we'll get started. Now, I don't know if any of you judges are familiar with the concepts of ships in the night, but basically what's happened in today's debate round is the opposition case is one ship and the resolution is the other ship, and they completely miss each other. And that's exactly what I'm going to be showing in today's debate round. But there was one very key response that my partner had in his speech that unfortunately went unresponded to, and that's going to be the key contention that I bring up. Now, what was that response? That was response to under the contention one of the opposition team. What they specifically talked about was the action itself. So for further clarification, let's look at the resolution we're talking about. Quote, the use of eminent domain is unjust. So as my partner stated, we are talking about the action. So let's look down the contentions that they brought up. Their first point was that it's for the community. They talk about corporate flight and how this would lead to job loss and lead to poor communities, and the impact of this was increased recidivism rates. They impacted this back to the roads, libraries, hospitals, power plants, military bases, and they basically talked about how all of this is going to increase higher. I actually have like 4 responses to this. The first response is it's still unjust. Again, still unjust. They recognize the fact that we are, in essence, taking away property rights from American citizens, which means, by definition, it is unjust. The second response is the ends versus the means. Again, the ends versus the means. I first really want to get this on your flow because it's something my partner touched on in his speech that when I responded to by the opposition team. The third response to this is necessity. Again, the third response to this is necessity. Again, as I mentioned in my very first speech, and they agreed to by not responding to it, the point we're talking about here is not whether it's necessary, not whether it's legal, rather whether it's just based on individual rights. So why does this matter? This matters because of the fourth and final response to all of their examples they're talking about how it increases, life in America because we now have roads, libraries, and hospitals. The fourth and final response to this argument is effects, not use. Again, effects, not use. All of the arguments of the opposition team are talking about the effects of using eminent domain, not the use of eminent domain. Point being, none of them apply to the resolution. Not only that, they never responded to when my partner brought this up in his last speech. So again, my response to the contention one of the opposition team was the action itself, never responded to that. So let's go ahead and get on down to the value where they talked about this. They said that specifically deontology actually justifies this. I have 2 responses to this. First of all, I don't think that word means what you think it means. The second response to this is obviously both teams agree we're talking about whether or not we should uphold the idea of individual rights. So with that out of the way, let's move into my 2 voting issues to respond to their voting issues. The first voting issue I'd like to present is that of individual rights. Again, the first voting issue is that of individual rights. Subpoint A is use of, not effects of. Again, use of, not effects of. The resolution we're talking about is whether or not the use of eminent domain is justified, not whether the effects of eminent domain make the use justified. Subpoint B into this is drop res point 3. Again, drop res point 3. This is specifically where I was talking about how we're not referring to necessity, we're not referring to legality, whether we're only referring to whether or not it is just. They never had a response to that, therefore by concession they agree. The impact of this argument is violation of rights. Again, the violation of rights. As we've illustrated throughout this entire debate, and they've even agreed to, the fact that you're taking property rights away from individuals does violate their right to property. It violates one of their most fundamental individual rights. So why should this impact your ballot? It should impact your ballot because that's the value. That's the criterion that we're weighing mechanism that both teams have agreed on for this debate. Meaning that if the use of eminent domain undermines that value, a government ballot is warranted. The second and final voting issue I'd like to present is that fundamentally unjust. Again, fundamentally unjust. This was the analysis I presented back in my very first speech, showing one very, very clear thing. That when the government comes and takes your property, they're taking your property. When they take your property, they're taking your right to own that property. Meaning by its very nature, the use of eminent domain, by definition, is unjust. Because it's literally the government, exactly like taxation, coming in and taking your right to either have money or to have property. So at the end of the debate, I ask you to vote on the value and on the resolution presented. Thank you very much.
Awesome. If I may, please stay seated.
Thank you very much.
They're gonna thank the judges and everything. We need to get the judges quickly out and prove that they fill out the ballot each guy can do so we can have a war. So we wait, that's not bad. So if I can just have you hold on for just a second, and if I could have the judges stand up, you'll be escorted out back to your carts, your chariots, please. Then it's a free for all. Hold on a second. Okay. Thank you.
I'm totally glad that made my last two judges.